Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and I'm actually kind of excited for this video, and the reason why is because this is actually going to be kind of like my very first video essay. Most of the time whenever I'm doing a video, it's either a battle report or I'm doing a product review of some sort for miniatures wargaming, or I'm showcasing something that we're doing, or giving you guys a tutorial on painting miniatures and saving money. And so because of that, I don't really break into the video essays too much, but one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video is because of the fact that Warhammer Fantasy, of course, is dead, but we do a lot of Warhammer Fantasy content on this channel. At the same time, coming up on the horizon, we also have Warhammer, the Old World, coming up here pretty soon. And I've been noticing a lot of things on YouTube. A lot of people have been talking about Warhammer Fantasy and why that game, eventually was discontinued by Games Workshop back in 2015. People like to cite things like lack of support, for example, updates from Games Workshop, miniatures from Games Workshop, balancing out rules. Some people like to blame the magic system, or there's a myriad of reasons that people have actually been showing reasons why Warhammer Fantasy failed. Now in this video, I'm kind of taking a different perspective of it because, as my screen name says, my name is Commander Cheapskate, and actually, in my opinion, the core reason why Warhammer Fantasy failed was due to one thing and one thing only, and that one thing was money. That was the basically thing that basically ended up killing it. So as you can see here, this is the game of Warhammer Fantasy. As you can see, I got a little picture here of Warhammer Fantasy battle. In case you guys were not aware what Warhammer Fantasy was a tabletop miniatures war game. Basically, you pitted armies against each other, and that's basically was the basis for the Warhammer Age of Sigmar universe that you guys have today. It basically lasted for about 33 years. This game was originally published in 1982 by Games Workshop, and it went all the way up through 8 different editions of that game, and eventually it was discontinued by Games Workshop in 2015. They ended up killing the product line because it weren't getting very much support from players, and they themselves decided to abandon this product, even though it had a very long and storied history that people absolutely love. In fact, even though the game was discontinued in 2015, it's 2022 now, and people are still playing it. So unfortunately, it went away and was replaced by Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So because of that, I was kind of sad about that part. And like I said before, just like as our good friend here, Lester Smalls, may he rest in peace, what money? You mean my money? That's exactly what caused the Warhammer Fantasy game to be discontinued. Specifically, money for that players had to pay in order to play this game. And basically, when you combine that with all the other additional reasons that people didn't like the game, it causes it to be basically fall apart. And that's exactly why. And the reason why is, like, yes, all the rules that people disagree with, things being overpowered or unbalanced, or magic rules or army composition rules, yes, these are all things that were really, really important, and yes, they did impact player ability playing that game. But that just adds to the core problem, and that core problem was the cost of entry and the money that you would need to spend in order to play that game. And that's what really killed it, because back when Warhammer was still around in its heyday, it was actually, yes, it was still pricey, but it was not outrageously so. And even though playing that might, like any of the miniatures war game, it would kind of hurt a little bit to get into the hobby because it was a little pricey for that time, but it was nowhere near the extent of what prices are now. And getting into that game, you take the really high cost entry and you combine all the other additional reasons I mentioned before, and you get a recipe for disaster. So in this video essay, what we're going to do is we're actually going to show you what I believe is what caused this whole situation to just compound in terms of actually people spending money to play this game, and eventually leading to its eventual downfall. So that being said, let's get this video essay on a roll. Alright, so continuing with my argument, money was the reason why Warhammer Fantasy basically was discontinued and why it fell apart towards the end in 2015. And the reason why we can know that money was actually the leading contributor, actually the primary contributor to this problem, is because if you look at different editions of Warhammer Fantasy and you look at the compositions required to make up your army, they were very, very different. So what I'm going to show you guys are some rule books from back in the day. So when I originally got involved with Warhammer Fantasy Battle was during its 4th edition. That was during the iteration that I played it. I played it primarily when I was a kid during the 4th edition as well as the 5th edition of Warhammer Fantasy. And when you look at those two editions, and I should have mentioned, by the way, it was a wrong 10-15 years in that time period when they made those changes. So that kind of shows you how very little Games Workshop actually updated their game system with later editions. But with that being said, I'm going to show you guys some army rule books, and I'm going to focus on High Elves. And the reason why I'm focusing on High Elves is because that was the army I played when I was a kid. I first got into it, and it's also the one whose rules I remember the most. being impacted, being changed by different editions, and that's the reason why I'm going to be focusing on that one. So let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. So first of all, this is actually a screenshot from the Warhammer Armies High Elf book from the 4th edition rules, and this is when I actually got into the game. And this right here is a perfect illustration of what I'm going to be talking about how army composition and Games Workshop basically requiring you to spend more money to play the game really impacted negatively. So if you look right here, we have the one page from the army composition book, and what I want you to draw your attention to is down here when it talks about army selection. At the time, your armies were basically divided up between different percentages for your different categories that you could take for your armies, much like it was in the 8th edition of Warhammer Fantasy. So as you can see right here for your army selection, you're allowed to spend up to 50% of your army's cost, up to half the points, may be spent on characters. This includes the cost of monsters written by characters, as well as magical items that your characters could take as well. People like to refer this time period as the Hero Hammer period of miniatures wargaming for Warhammer, and the reason why is because in this edition, characters, special characters, they were the real killing power of your army back during that time period. So at that time, you could spend up to half your points on your characters, and I'm going to talk about how that was important here in a second. Now, the next thing you had, of course, was regiments, all right? And I have spent at least 25%, at least a quarter of your total points of value of the army must be spent on regiments. This does not include the cost of champions who are paid out of the character allowance. So, 25%, if you notice, there's nothing that says core at all. Just to give you guys an idea, if it wasn't a war machine or a monster, it was considered a regiment. And so because of that, you only had to pay 25% of your army to that. That includes what would be considered today as rare and special choices, as well as core choices. All three of those were lumped together in the exact same category. So as you can see right off the bat, you don't have to worry about that 25% core that you have to buy. You're not obligated to do so. All you have to do is have any kind of combination of regiments leading up to 25% at that time, which is a huge money saver, and I'm going to show you an example of what I'm talking about here in a little bit. The other 25%, of course, went to war machines, also monsters as well. Now, these are additional monsters you add to your army. Any monsters that are written by characters was in the character allowance, so if you wanted to add just a dragon by itself, you could do so long as it was up to 25% of your army selection. And then back during this time period as well, you could also take allies as well. As it says, up to a quarter of the point value of this army may be spent on allied troops chosen from any of the following list or lists: Bretonnia, Dwarves, Empire, and Wood Elves. So, back during this time period, you could take allied units as well. So that was another thing that was also kind of cool too. So let's pretend that you're playing a High Elf army, but you have some spare Empire miniatures lying around. And let's say you're trying to build a 2,000 point High Elf army, but you don't have enough High Elf miniatures to make that 2,000 points. Well, you could throw them into your allied category with those Empire miniatures, and you could buff your army to make up to the full point value that you wanted to as well. So this is an example of what I was talking about when it comes to army composition that you see for 4th edition, all right? So now that you know exactly how your army selection was made up of, let's go ahead and talk about the point values real quick that you would have seen in the 4th edition. So I'm going to close this real quick, and I'm going to open up another one. So this is the actual page from the regiments section of Warhammer Fantasy. So let's go ahead and talk about exactly what you're looking at here. So as you can see here, we have several units located here. We have units that would be considered core units in today's version of Warhammer Fantasy, as well as special units as well, which would be considered special units today. Back then, they didn't have those designations. All they had was the keyword regiment, and every single unit that you had consisted of that, which at least 25% of your army had to be used for that, okay? So for example, High Elf Spearmen back then cost about 12 points apiece, and as you can see, that's the equipment they carried. As you can see, High Elf Archers were 10 points apiece back then as well. High Elf Warriors, yes, you could just have just normal warriors with hand weapons and shields. They cost 9 points. Lothar Sea Guard cost 12. You could give them bows at plus 2 points. You could also switch out their spears for halberds for 1 point apiece. So as you can see, the point values were actually quite high during the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy. Having huge units of 40 to 50 miniatures at any one time was considered like extreme rarity in the 4th edition Warhammer scene. To be perfectly honest, if you had 20 miniatures in one unit, that was considered like the largest unit that most people saw on the tabletop at that time period. Anything higher than 20 was like, oh my god, you must be playing goblins or you must be playing Skaven or something to get numbers higher than that. And that was the thing that they did for all these different units. All you had to do is just get enough to make up your 25% and you're good. Now, for elite units, for example, like White Lions of Trace, for example, they basically have this neat little designation where either you don't have to take any of those units if you don't want to, or if you did want to take a unit, you only took one. So people who were worried about balance and having overpowered unit choices and things and multiples of those choices, that wasn't actually real big of an issue back then because you only got the one chance of creating a unit of White Lions. For example, if you wanted to take other special choices, if I want to take something like White Lions, it had to be Swordmasters of Hoeth, or it had to be Phoenix Guard, for example. And as you can see, these guys cost 14 points apiece back then as well. So the point values for the miniatures were actually quite high during the 4th edition version of Warhammer Fantasy. And the same thing with the 5th edition. 5th edition, they actually made some improvements, just a lot of units. They would give you things like buying armor and stuff like that for the high elves, so that way you can make your warriors a little bit more last longer in battle. So the point values were actually quite high during that time period, which meant that you had to spend less money to actually field an army as well. And like I said, we're actually going to break down the cost benefit here in a second, later on in this video. But this is an example of what I was talking about. So you can see the point values are actually very, very high, which means you need less models to play. At the same time, you don't need as many miniatures to fulfill your regiment requirements for your army, and you can spend the rest of your points on allies, war machines, monsters, or characters in some cases. Up to half your army could be made up of characters at that time, which meant that, let's pretend if you're a first time player and you don't have very much money, you could just have a couple of units of soldiers in your army and then spend most of your point values on your characters, so that way you could beef it up to the point value you want to play at, and of course buy more miniatures as you have over time, and then shrink your character allowance, for example, or whatever the case may be. So it wasn't really all that expensive to get into this hobby just right off the bat, because the point values were so much different back then during 4th edition. Now, this was the tradition that they kept for 4th and 5th edition, which pretty much made up most of the 90s, as well as all the early, mid, as well, actually the entire 90s decade. It's just easier to say it that way. So because of that, this is where people really got into it, and that's where they really had their heyday for their miniatures wargaming. Now, all this unfortunately changed in the year 2000, because in the year 2000, what ended up happening was we had 6th edition pop up for Warhammer Fantasy. And that was kind of a weird addition. At the same time, this is also where I kind of fell out of Warhammer when I was younger. I had other things to do during that time period. I was much older, so my attention was focused elsewhere. Video games became very, very popular in that time. So because I kind of fell out of Warhammer, my friends and I would meet every once in a while to play 4th and 5th edition Warhammer, but for the most part, though, we really were all not involved. But during 6th edition, though, one of the huge changes that took place during this time period was army compositions. Alright, so let's go and talk about that real quick. So, when it came to our army compositions, as you can see, what ended up happening is that they decided to keep the same point values as before, with 2,000 points and higher, but they decided to manipulate your army composition a bit. As you can see, if you play 2,000 points at the base, you only can get a max total of 4 characters total, 1 hero, or 1 lord, or 4 heroes, or any combination thereof, max of 1 lord and a couple of heroes. So because of that, the point value that you normally spend on your characters died off in the 6th edition, so that was the end of the Hero Hammer era. However, that came at a cost though. And the reason why is because since you didn't have to put so many points in your characters anymore, those points that were usually taken up by characters had to go back to your army. And so because that required you to purchase more miniatures over time. Also in the 6th edition of Warhammer Hammer, we start seeing the brand new idea of core, special, as well as rare units. Which meant that if you wanted to field an army at 2,000 points, you had to at least get 3 core choices in your army. You were allowed up to 4 different special choices and up to 2 rare choices. Now, that may seem a lot easier to do than point value, so that's one thing that was kind of nice about it. But what ended up happening, though, is that this created a precedence for later editions of Warhammer Fantasy, which meant that you had to spend points on core choices. Now, these core choices, you may or may not even want them in your army, but it doesn't matter whether you want them or not, because you have to have them because army composition rules state so. And at the same time, they also reduced so one, they have to have this now, this core idea. So core really changed up how armies were made up from 6th edition all the way on, both in the rules and in the price that you had to pay to get those miniatures. So they did that as well, so that's the one thing they did. And the second thing they did too is they also lowered the point values on a lot of units. So let's go and close this real quick. So here's another page from that 6th edition rulebook here, and here's some of our core unit choices that we had at the time. So of course we have Lothar Sea Guard, right? They're 15 points. Now as you can see for this one though, the price points is relatively the same around at the same time as Warhammer Fantasy from the 4th edition. But let's take another unit look at another unit though. That unit's being Silverhelm Knights. Now Silverhelm Knights in the 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy were 19 points apiece, alright, for 6th edition. But back during the 4th edition rules, those guys were around 31 points apiece. All right, so as you can see there, 31 points versus 19 points, that's a huge price difference. So if you can see here, they did this not just to Silverhelms, but they did this to a lot of different core choices that you could have in your army. What that did is that because you lowered the core point value for the core choices, that meant you had to purchase more miniatures to meet that core requirement, and you had to at least have 3 units of this type, which means you generate additional money for the company, which is great, I guess. But for the player, though, they get less point value per miniature, which means they're forced to spend more money on top of that. And that was a huge impact on Warhammer. Actually, from Warhammer 6th edition all the way until its end with the end times at the end of the 8th edition, that became just the going rate for the for Warhammer army. You had to pay that core requirement, whether you wanted those units or not. You had at least had 25% of your army to be up there, especially when you got to 8th edition, and the prices increased and the point value for the miniatures decreased. And you put those two together and throw in all the additional other issues that people had with Warhammer Fantasy, and it's a perfect storm of disaster. So now that we're done talking about the rules and the point values and the army composition for these armies for High Elves, let's go and talk about what the price difference would be in order to purchase an army to play this game. Alright, so now we're going to go to the cost analysis of this entire thing, like we said about earlier. So, before you, I have 2 different army lists. Now, once again, we are talking about High Elves, except the one on the left-hand side, of the screen, this is a 2,000 point army using 4th edition rules, and then on the right-hand side, this is an 8th edition High Elf army with 2,000 points as well. And we're going to show you exactly what I mean about the lowering of the point values for each of the units as time went on. So, let's take a look at this real quick. So, on the left-hand side, this is what you would have to have in order to have a 2,000 point High Elf army list. So as you can see, I break it down to characters. 50% of my army can be made up of characters. My regiments are up to be at least minimum 25%, and a maximum of 25% for my war machines. So as you can see in this one on the left hand side here, for my characters, I'm going to spend 846 points of my 2,000 points on characters. I'm going to use a special character Teclis. He's got 575 points for him. A High Elf General, because you have to have one of these in your army at a minimum, so 167 points there, and a Battle Standard Bearer, which is to cost me 104 points for all their various equipments. As you can see, I got the point values listed thusly. So that would have been my character requirement. As you can see, just 3 miniatures, not so bad. Now for my regiments, if you notice, I don't have to take any minimum core requirements if I don't want to. I could take nothing but elite unit choices if I want to, so long as they meet that 25% regiment requirement. So it wasn't that bad. Now in this situation, let's go and talk about what I have here. I have 5 Reaver Knights. They cost 23 points apiece. I have their various upgrades with bows, spears, shields. That give it to 155 points. 19 High Elf Spearmen, they cost 12 points apiece. I gave them a Standard Bearer Musician, which was the half of the price of a normal character. Combine that together, 240 points. I have 12 Archers, they cost 10 points apiece. I upgraded them with this Musician and Standard Bearer, as well as with Longbows, 142 points. I then have 20 Swordmasters of Hoeth that cost 16 points apiece. Upgrade them with Standard Bearer Musician, 336 points. Alright, and then finally I have my War Machines, of course, and with my War Machines, I have 3 Bolt Throwers, 150 points, 50 points apiece, for 150 points in total. When I add this whole army up together, it ends up with a grand total of 1,869 points, which leaves me a spare 131 points for magic items for my characters, and that's pretty much how the army would look. Alright, pretty easy, pretty small units. So you're talking about here 4 regiments, 3 war machines, 3 characters, not that large of a deal. Now, let's go ahead and flip it to the other side. Let's talk about our 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy army with my High Elves. So as you can see there, Teclis, 450 points, 575 points over here. I have a Noble for my Battle Standard Bearer, so it cost me 141 points. As you can see there with all the upgrades and the magic items, as opposed to 104 points. But still, at the same time, though, I can't spend as much magical items on the Battle Standard Bearer from my High Elf army list for 4th edition as I could for my 8th edition one. Now, this is where we start seeing the price differences come in for points, alright? So, like I said before, in Warhammer 4th edition, all you gotta do is you do your regiment requirement 25%. It could be any combination of regiments, you're perfectly fine. But in the 8th edition, I have to pay at least a 25% core requirement cost. So, I got my 5 Illyrian Reavers, but they only cost 95 points, as opposed to 115 points back then. I have my unit of 20 Spearmen with upgrades for their unit. That cost me 200 points in the 8th edition, 240 points in Warhammer Fantasy 4th edition, alright? So you can see there a little bit of a difference in point value already. 12 Archers, 152 points. Archers from 4th edition, 142 points. Now then, if you notice, I still have to have more core requirements, which means I have to buy a box now of Silver Helm Knights that cost me 135 points, and now that I have my 25% core requirement done with, I can now get other units. But now you might be thinking, well, Commander Cheapskate, this is great. You met your core requirements, you shouldn't have to spend any more. However, my special requirements, though, don't cost as many points. Case in point, Swordmasters of Hoeth, 20 of them, with full command, as well as a 50-point Banner of the World Dragon. All that combined, 340 points. Just bare bones 20 Swordmasters of Hope with no magic banner, 336 points. So you can see I have to spend this much as well as additional magic items to reach the same amount of points almost. So, but I have to also have another unit too. If you notice, I couldn't have another unit of White Lions in the 4th edition one, but I do in the 8th edition one. I have to buy a box of 20 White Lions of Thrace for 290 points as well. And of course my 3 Eagle Claw Bolthers, 210 points. These actually cost more points than the original ones from Warhammer Fantasy 4th edition. But as you can see here though, lists are pretty much similar, but I have to buy 2 additional units, my Silver Helms and my White Lions of Thrace, to get the same amount of point value as my older edition Warhammer Fantasy did. And that's where this is where I'm talking about when it comes to cost, because these miniatures cost money, all right, and quite a bit of money as well. Except in the 4th edition from back in the mid-90s, I don't have to spend as much money to build a 2,000 point army as I do here. As you can see, I have 4 regiments in total that I have for my army with 3 war machines, and this one I have 6 regiments. So I'm buying 2 more regiments than I originally had in my 2,000 point army from 1996 and back into where 9th, 8th edition fell apart. So you can see here, in the end, I end up with 213 points in total, but you know, right here I have spare for magic items, so you can see what the difference in the size of the army is going to be. So if you're a brand new player playing at basic 2,000 points for Warhammer Fantasy in 8th edition, you have to spend way more money than you would have to during the 4th edition. And another thing that also adds, so this is the disparity between point values like I was talking about before. So you take the disparity between the 2 different point values of both systems, and when you combine that with the cost of miniatures, that's just going to make the problem even worse. And that's the next thing we're going to talk about, is how much these armies would have cost you between the 2 different editions. Okay, so now we've talked about, of course, we've talked about the differences for army compositions between the different editions of Warhammer being a contributing factor to why it fell apart. We also took a look at the point values that between the both editions as well over time, so that way we can see exactly what also caused Warhammer to fail in the end. Now we're going to get to the core root of the problem. So you take all those other issues I mentioned before and you throw money into the mix, and you're going to create a hurricane of destruction that's going to end a game that had over a 33-year history going on. So let's go and talk about exactly the cost. As you can see here, I got 2 different lists here. The one on the left-hand side is a 4th edition High Elf Army list. That was that 2,000 point army we looked at before, and I break down the price of what it would cost you in order to purchase that army over time. And we have the exact same thing happening over here with the previous edition, with 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy with High Elf Army. And that was the same list we looked at before. We're going to talk about the price differences between them. And let's talk about that real quick. So let's talk about the 4th edition Army High Elf Army list. So these prices are back to 1996 prices, but don't worry, I'm going to adjust for inflation here a little bit to show you what the grand total would be. So if you were to buy the tech list miniature from the 4th edition time period, it's going to cost you $7 for that blister pack. You got the special character, cost you $7. Oppose that to 8th edition, you get 1 clan pack for tech list, that ends up being $30. All right, $7, $30. Okay, but we're not done yet. So let's assume now that we want to get a miniature for our High Elf General as well as our Battle Center Bear that we had for 2,000 points. What we could do is buy a Command Group blister. A Command Group blister was a blister that had 1 Champion miniature, 1 Standard Bear Musician, and 1 Musician miniature. So you can have all 3. You keep the Standard Bear and the Champion to make these characters, and keep your Musician on hand for spare. That blister would have cost you $5 for this whole situation right over here. All right, going back to our example for 8th edition, you need to buy 1 clan pack character for your noble. That would cost you around $30 today. Okay, so 5, 30, 3 miniatures, 1 miniature. But we're not done yet. So let's talk about regiments now. So back in the day, buying box sets of miniatures was actually kind of a rarity during the 4th edition time period. You primarily had to buy blisters, but that was perfectly fine though, because you had multiple miniatures per blister. So let's go and talk about that real quick. So if we wanted to purchase enough blisters to make our 5-man unit Reaver Knights, we have to buy 3 blisters packs to make this guy, and each blister pack had 2 miniatures per blister. That was going to cost you a grand total of $15, basically $5 per blister. And of course, one of these Reaver Knights, you would actually have 6 miniatures in all, but in the end though, that didn't matter because you could use 5 of them, and of course you set the other one up to be used for spare. Now for your High Elf spare, now if we were to compare that with Games Workshop prices, 1 box set of 5 of those guys would be $33 in 8th edition. So 15, $33. You seeing how this is going? Now you could get some boxes of High Elf Spearmen back then. They came in boxes of 12, so 2 boxes of 12 miniatures would have cost you $40 for that. Going back over here to 8th edition, you had to buy 2 boxes of 20 Spearmen at $35 a piece, $70. So $70 versus $40. Seeing the price difference. Same thing with 1 box of 12 miniatures for High Elf Archers, that would cost you $20. You had to get one box set of those guys too. I think they came in boxes at 12, I think, and that cost around $35, but still, 35, 20. See the price difference? Now, we're still not done yet because we got to do our core requirement now. So all these prices right now are done with our archers, spearmen, and our Illyrian reavers. But now we have to buy a box of Silverhelm Knights because we got to fulfill our core requirement. That costs us $38 for 5 of those guys. So as you can see there, that's $38 more than we have to pay over here. Now let's go with our special choices. So because of our regiment choices here in the High Elf Army Edition, let's pretend I'm going to go to a unit of 20 Sword Masters of Hoth. You get 2 miniatures per blisters, which means you have to buy 10 of these blister packs. And that's going to cost you $50 in total, which is the most expensive thing that we have on here, okay? Now, let's take a look at our 8th edition version. To get Sword Masters of Hoth, you need to buy 2 box sets. And the reason why you need to buy 2 boxes is because you only get 10 Sword Masters per box set. 10 Sword Masters per box set, need 2 of them to make a full unit of 20 at $50 a piece, costs you $100 for that. So even though this is $50 over here versus $100 over here, we're spending $50 more to get the exact same size of unit with plastic, where these guys would have been pewter back in the day. But we're not done, because remember, the point values are different. So right here, we'd be done with our units. But in the 8th edition, though, the point values are lower, so we had to buy another 2 box sets to make our unit of 20 White Lions. 10 White Lions per box set, so you need 2 of them to make 20. They cost $50 a piece, $100 extra on this side that we didn't have to worry about over here on the 4th edition side. Now we go to our war machines. We need to purchase 3 blisters of bolt throwers, 1 bolt thrower miniature per blister. That's going to cost you $30 total, $10 per blister for war machines back then. Over here, you need to buy 3 box sets of eagle claw bolt throwers. They cost $30 a piece. You're going to spend $90 over here. So, as you can see, if we were to purchase all these things at 1996 prices, it's going to cost us $167 in order to purchase this entire army. Now, if we adjust for inflation, which is modern day, which is 2022, so that $167 in 1996 becomes $297.26 in today's money in 2022, which is still kind of pricey, but not as bad as, bam, 8th edition. So when we're talking about all the things we need to purchase to make this an 8th edition 2000 point army, we're talking about a grand total of $526 to purchase this, okay? So if we compare that to the 4th edition cost of $297, because we're adjusting for inflation, so $297.26, and we subtract the 2, we're talking about a total difference of $228.74. All right, that's the cost of a starter box. All right, for today's editions of Warhammer Age of Sigmar or Warhammer 40k or Necromunda or whatever. So as you can see right off the bat, you can see the price difference coming in between the 2 editions, all right? So in the 4th edition, we had less miniatures needed to make up our army, and the prices were pretty fair for that time period. As opposed to 8th edition, we need way more miniatures now for the exact same size army because our point values are lower, but the prices are skyrocketing on these guys as well, to the point where we're almost saving over $228 in difference between the two armies, okay? And this goes back to my core argument. The money was the reason why, the price to play this game was the reason why it fell, all right, why it failed in the end. You take all the other issues that people have with that game and you combine it with the core price of spending $526 for a game that has a lot of problems, as opposed to $297, perfect recipe for disaster, like I said before. Alright, so in conclusion, money was the core reason why Warhammer Fantasy fell apart. Okay, that's just pure and simple to the point, okay? Get past all the rules, all the gripes about balance, all the gripes about things being overpowered, magic army composition rule, all that stuff. You take it out, throw it out the window. It came down to price, okay? Because people don't have a lot of money. All right, or rather, they don't have a lot of money to spend on luxury items or things for fun or for like toys, that kind of thing. Okay, so because of that, it is a problem. It is a huge concern, especially if you're playing a game that costs so much money and maybe you might not even enjoy it. So the need to actually break into that game is not really all that there, especially when you compare the number of miniatures you need to purchase between Warhammer Fantasy and, let's say, Warhammer 40k. You don't need nearly as many miniatures from Warhammer 40k to play that game as you do Warhammer Fantasy in terms of the number of miniatures you need. So it's a no-brainer that people are not going to play Warhammer Fantasy. They'll go to 40k. It's cheaper. All right, you can get, you don't have to need as many miniatures as you do with Warhammer Fantasy, and at the same time, it's also really supported by the group. Unfortunately, you have to worry about edition changes taking place almost every 3 to 6 months, but still, it's a game that a lot of people play, and there's a lot of people playing it. Whereas with Warhammer Fantasy, that was not the case because the price was so high the cost of entry is so high in order to play the game, and people might not enjoy the rules, whatever the case may be, and so because of that, it died out. So, Warhammer Fantasy is dead, unfortunately, and however, though, Games Workshop is trying to bring it back, though. They're bringing it back with a new game coming out here pretty soon called Warhammer the Old World, and this was based on the love that they received from the Warhammer Total War video game. In fact, Warhammer Total War probably did more to promote Warhammer Fantasy to the general public than anything else up to that point. People were, of course, playing that game. They realized, oh wait, this is a tabletop miniatures game. It's based off of a fictional setting made by Games Workshop, and people were like, that sounds cool, and they wanted to actually play the board game, only to find out that miniatures war game no longer exists because it got killed in 2015. Instead, you got Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and they're like, what's Age of Sigmar? They have no experience with it because all their experiences have been based in the old world. So because of that popularity, Games Workshop is now doing Warhammer the Old World. My big fear about that, though, is that if they don't do it right, if they keep on making the same mistakes they made in the past with Warhammer Fantasy, it's going to be another game that gets destroyed in time. And that setting, that universe, that lore, all the rules associated with that time period, people love it. In fact, we're still in 2022. I'm making Warhammer Fantasy content still, and people still love it, even to this day. So this game can make a really good comeback. Games Workshop just needs to be really, really careful about how they handle it. And the way, for me, because of the way I'm analyzing it, it's money is the core issue, all right? So Games Workshop, if you want to bring back this game, don't make the same mistakes you made from 6th edition onward, all right? Don't jack up the prices so ridiculously high and require miniatures that people don't even want to include in their army to actually make that ends meet, all right? If you really, really want to solve it, the best way to actually do this, if you really want to get down to it, do the whole regiments requirement like they did back during 4th edition, all right, with the army composition. All right, just loop all of your units together in one, call it regiments, make it at least 25%, make it 50% characters. That way, if you don't have enough money to purchase regiments, you can just throw in your character miniatures instead, and you'll be set to go. That'd be probably the easiest way of actually doing that. Now, I know people will scream about balance and using overpowered units and so on and so forth, but if you do it that way, it doesn't cost you as much money. After all, I just showed you examples of point values for army compositions as well as the money involved to make those armies just on the previous portions of this video. And you can see the cost saving benefit already, over $200 saved by just actually making that one small little adjustment. And so because of that, I think if they manage to do that for Warhammer the Old World, the game will probably be successful. People will really be into it. Another thing that they might want to look into as well is backwards compatibility. Allow people to take Age of Sigmar stuff and use it in Warhammer the Old World. Now, I know some people might gripe and complain about it, but from a cost saving aspect, that'd be very, very attractive to a lot of people who play Warhammer Age of Sigmar. They might look at Warhammer the Old World and be like, oh, I could use some of my miniatures from Age of Sigmar and I could use them in Warhammer the Old World. Well, maybe I'll do that. And they'll do it. And they'll buy the additional stuff from the miniatures from the Old World they'll need to in order to make a full, complete army. So allowing that backwards compatibility, that would really help you out a lot in order to make sure that that game becomes successful. But there you go. That's my viewpoint. Pretty much the core reason why Warhammer Fantasy fell apart was because of money. And that, at top of everything else, just made that problem even worse to where they eventually killed it in 2015. So that's going to do for this video essay, you guys. Tell me what you guys think. Do you like the video essay format? Should I keep on doing these or not? I'm thinking about doing this a couple other things, talking about tactics and stuff, but that's just me. Anyways, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest, greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good to do for this, you guys. I'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.